A German submarine surfaces off the coast of Canada. May 1945. The war in Europe is over, but this crew does not yet know what that means for them. They stand on the deck of U-889, hands visible, squinting against salt spray and gray light. They have been told what comes next. Punishment, violence, disappearance. None of it happens. What follows is silence, order, and professionalism. And for these men, the first real defeat is not military. It is the slow, unbearable collapse of everything they were trained to believe. On the 8th of May, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Adolf Hitler was already dead. Berlin had fallen. The instruments of unconditional surrender had been signed. Across the continent, soldiers laid down weapons, civilians emerged from shelters, and cities fell silent beneath the weight of what had happened. But the war did not end everywhere at once. For a handful of German submarines still at sea in the North Atlantic, May 8th was not a conclusion. It was a question. U-889 was one of those submarines. She had left Kiel on the 28th of March 1945, arrived at Horten, Norway 2 days later, and on the 2nd of April sailed west with orders to attack shipping in the approaches to Halifax. She was a Type 9 C/40 ocean-going U-boat, built by Deschimag AG Weser in Bremen and commissioned on the 4th of August 1944 under the command of Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Breuker. This was her first war patrol, having left Germany in March, stopping in Norway before heading into the Atlantic in early April. By the time Dönitz broadcast his surrender order, U-889 had been at sea for over 5 weeks. The crew had operated under radio discipline, running submerged for long stretches, using the boat's newly fitted schnorchel to breathe while remaining hidden beneath the surface. They had not fired a single torpedo. They had not sunk a single ship. They had been moving toward the Canadian coast, slowly, carefully, as if the war would last forever. Then the transmissions came. First, fragments, garbled signals suggesting ceasefire. Then clearer messages from BDU, the U-boat command, ordering all submarines to cease hostilities, surface, and report their positions. For men sealed inside a steel tube thousands of miles from home, with no independent way to verify what they were hearing, the messages were not reassuring. They were terrifying. Every U-boat commander had been warned about enemy deception. Allied intelligence had mimicked German signals before. False orders had been used to lure submarines into traps. The crew of U-889 had no way to confirm that the voice on the radio was truly German command and not a British ruse designed to bring them to the surface where they could be destroyed. So they waited. They listened. They debated. The hours stretched. The boat drifted south of Newfoundland, still submerged, still running on electric motors, still unsure whether the world above the waterline had changed forever or whether this was just another test. The air grew thick, the batteries drained. The silence of the deep offered no answers. For the men aboard, the war had not ended. It had simply become impossible to understand. Subscribe if you want more hidden WWII histories told carefully. To understand what the crew of U-889 carried inside themselves as they drifted in the North Atlantic that May, you must understand what they had been taught. Not just tactically, not just operationally, but psychologically. The indoctrination that shaped a German submariner did not begin when he boarded a U-boat. It began years earlier, in classrooms, in youth organizations, in newsreels, in the slow and deliberate construction of a worldview designed to make surrender unthinkable. From the earliest stages of their training, German naval cadets were taught that the Western Allies were not liberators. They were conquerors. They were colonial powers who had humiliated Germany after the First War with the Treaty of Versailles, stripped her of territory, extracted crippling reparations, and left an entire generation in poverty. The British, in particular, were cast as the eternal enemy of German naval ambition, a seafaring empire that had strangled the Kaiserliche Marine in 1918 and would do so again to any German sailor who fell into its hands. The Americans were portrayed as naive, materialistic, culturally shallow, and dangerously vindictive when provoked. The Canadians, when mentioned at all, were treated as extensions of the British Crown, compliant tools of London's imperial reach. But beyond politics, something darker was woven into the fabric of training. German submariners were told, through indirect suggestion and direct warning, that capture by the enemy would result in degradation. Propaganda films and briefings implied that Allied interrogation methods were brutal. Prisoners would be beaten, starved, humiliated. Officers would be stripped of rank. Enlisted men would be used as forced labor. The Geneva Convention, they were told, was a piece of paper that the Allies would invoke when it suited them and ignore when it did not. Every German sailor was made to believe that the safest place to be was inside the boat, following orders, fighting the war. The moment you left the boat, you left the protection of your comrades and entered the hands of men who hated you. This was not subtle. This was policy. The Kriegsmarine reinforced this through compartmentalization. Submariners were kept isolated from the broader military apparatus. They trained together, deployed together, and when they returned to port, they socialized together. They did not hear dissenting views. They did not read foreign newspapers. They did not speak with prisoners who had been returned. The information environment inside the U-boat arm was sealed as tightly as the pressure hull of the submarines themselves. And for the men of U-889, this was especially potent. The boat itself was so new it had never fired a shot in anger. The captain, Breuker, was just 26 years old. Most of the crew were younger still. The average age of a U-boat crew was 20 years old. These were men who had grown up entirely inside the propaganda machine of the Third Reich. They had no adult memories of a Germany before National Socialism. The world they knew was the world they had been given, and that world told them, clearly and consistently, that the men waiting for them on the other side of the ocean were not fellow sailors. They were instruments of revenge. So when the surrender transmissions crackled through the radio room of U-889, the crew did not hear an invitation to safety. They heard a potential trap. They heard the possibility of everything they had been warned about. And the weight of that belief, layered over years of training and isolation, was heavier than any depth charge the Allies could drop. It is easy, decades later, to dismiss this as foolishness. But indoctrination does not feel like indoctrination to the person inside it. It feels like knowledge. It feels like preparation. It feels like the only thing standing between you and annihilation. And that is exactly what it was, designed to feel like. There was a word for what the Kriegsmarine expected of its submarine commanders in the final hours of the war. The word was Regenbogen, rainbow. It was the code name for one of the most deliberate acts of self-destruction in modern naval history. Regenbogen was the code name for the planned mass scuttling of the German U-boat fleet to avoid surrender at the end of World War II. The operation was a directive issued by Admiral Karl Dönitz on the 30th of April 1945, ordering the mass scuttling of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet to prevent capture by Allied forces and to uphold the service's honor amid Germany's impending defeat. The logic was naval tradition dressed in ideology. Warships were not to be handed over. They were to be denied, destroyed, sent to the bottom rather than allowed to fly an enemy flag. The order was not theoretical. On the 1st of May, 3 U-boats were wrecked at Warnemünde, outside Rostock on the Baltic coast. On the 2nd of May, a further 32 U-boats were scuttled at Travemünde, near Lübeck. The destruction accelerated. Crews opened sea valves, flooded ballast tanks, and watched their boats settle into the harbors they had once departed from with confidence. The Kriegsmarine was eating itself. On the 4th of May, the Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower allowed the German forces in northwest Europe to surrender to Montgomery. Montgomery insisted that German naval forces, including the U-boat arm, be surrendered intact. This was a direct contradiction of the Regenbogen Doctrine. The Allies wanted the boats. Dönitz had ordered them destroyed. In the early hours of the 5th of May, the Regenbogen order was given, only to be countermanded 8 minutes later, to avoid jeopardizing the surrender negotiations. 8 minutes. In that span, the entire doctrine of scuttling was issued and then revoked. But the revocation did not reach everyone. Despite this, a further 87 boats were destroyed on the 5th of May alone, 64 on the Baltic and 23 on the North Sea coast. Over the last 7 days of the war, at least 195 U-boats had been scuttled. Some commanders followed the original order, some followed the countermand. Some simply made their own decisions based on what they believed, what they feared, and what they could not verify. And that was the crisis facing U-889. The boat was thousands of miles from the German coast. Its crew had no direct contact with flotilla command. The radio transmissions they received were contradictory, layered with confusion, and impossible to authenticate with certainty. The question of whether to scuttle was not abstract. It was mechanical. Every man aboard knew how to destroy the boat. The procedures were drilled into them. Open the valves, flood the compartments, set the demolition charges, abandon the hull and watch it go down. It could be done in minutes. It had been done hundreds of times, by other crews in other waters. But scuttling in the middle of the North Atlantic was not the same as scuttling in a Baltic harbor within sight of shore. Out here, there were no rescue boats, no friendly coastline, no certainty that anyone would find them. A crew of 48 men in life rafts, hundreds of miles from land, in May waters cold enough to kill in minutes, was not a controlled withdrawal. It was a death sentence disguised as honor. The alternative was surrender, but surrender meant surfacing, and surfacing meant exposure. Exposure to aircraft, exposure to warships, exposure to the unknown. The crew had been told what the enemy would do. They had been trained to believe that capture was worse than death. And now they were being asked to choose between those options with no reliable information, no command authority, and no margin for error. Inside the pressure hull of U-889, the air was stale. The diesel fumes lingered. The condensation dripped from every surface. Men sat in their stations, waiting. Some checked the torpedo tubes, some monitored the hydrophones, some simply stared at the bulkheads and tried to calculate the odds. The boat had not been damaged. The crew was intact. The weapons were functional. During later interrogation, Breuker would explain that after he received the surrender order, 4 frigates approached him, and he could have engaged them all. He had the capability. He had the training. What he lacked was certainty. And in the absence of certainty, the doctrine of scuttling and the doctrine of surrender pulled in opposite directions with equal force. The decision had not yet been made, but the clock was running. And somewhere above the surface, the Allies were already looking. On the afternoon of the 10th of May, U-889 was spotted south of Newfoundland by an RCAF airplane, steaming at 10 knots and flying a black flag. The aircraft was a consolidated Liberator from No. 10 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, on a general reconnaissance patrol covering the western approaches. The crew of the Liberator had been briefed on the possibility of German submarines surfacing in the area. The surrender orders had been broadcast for days, but no one knew which boats would comply, which would fight, and which would try to run. The Liberator descended to confirm the sighting. Below, the gray hull of a submarine cut through moderate swells, its conning tower visible, its deck clear of personnel. The black flag was unmistakable, a signal recognized across navies as a marker of surrender or distress. But the aircrew could not take it at face value. U-boats had feigned surrender before. Crews had used white flags to buy time while preparing deck guns. The war in the Atlantic had taught hard lessons about trust. It took 2 passes by the RCAF Liberator before U-889's crew hoisted the black flag of surrender. The aircraft crew was arming depth charges and setting the bomb site when the German crew gave up. This detail matters, because it means that for a span of seconds, perhaps a minute, the men inside that aircraft were preparing to attack, and the men on the submarine below were watching an aircraft circle them with bomb bay doors open. Both sides were operating on incomplete information. Both sides were afraid. The Liberator stood by until the Canadian ships appeared about an hour later. It circled at altitude, maintaining visual contact, radioing the position to Naval Command. The submarine remained on the surface, holding course, holding speed, holding the flag aloft. Inside the pressure hull, the crew could hear the engines of the aircraft through the hull. They could feel the vibration of their own diesels. They could hear the ocean. What they could not hear was any indication of what would happen next. For the aircrew, the sighting was procedural. They had trained for this. They had protocols. Identify, confirm, report, maintain contact. But for the men on U-889, the appearance of the Liberator was the first moment the outside world intruded on their isolation. For weeks they had existed in a sealed environment, submerged, disconnected, running on assumptions and training. Now there was an aircraft overhead. Now there were eyes on them. Now the decision they had been debating in the dark was being made in the light. The sea was gray. The sky was overcast. The wind carried salt and cold. The Liberator banked and circled. The submarine held steady. And somewhere between those two machines, between the men in the air and the men on the water, the war began to change shape. Not with an explosion, not with an order, but with the simple, terrifying act of being seen. Subsequently, HMCS Oshawa, HMCS Rockcliffe, HMCS Saskatoon, and HMCS Dunvegan intercepted U-889 some 175 miles south-southeast of Cape Race. The Canadian warships arrived in formation, spreading across the horizon like a line drawn in the water. The submarine did not dive. The submarine did not fire. The submarine waited. And the tension between what the crew expected and what was actually happening grew wider with every passing minute. The Canadian ships that approached U-889 that afternoon were not battleships. They were not destroyers bristling with heavy armament. They were escorts, corvettes and minesweepers, working vessels of the Royal Canadian Navy, crewed by men who had spent years guarding convoys across the most dangerous ocean in the world. HMCS Oshawa was an Algerine-class minesweeper, HMCS Rockcliffe was another. HMCS Saskatoon was a Flower-class corvette, a type of ship that had become the backbone of the Canadian Atlantic escort fleet, a vessel not built for glamour, but for endurance. HMCS Dunvegan was another corvette, similarly modest, similarly functional. These ships did not look like conquerors. They looked like what they were: tired, practical machines operated by tired, practical men who had been doing this work for years. The Canadian sailors who manned these vessels had lost friends to U-boats. They had pulled survivors from torpedoed merchant ships. They had listened on sonar as submarines moved beneath their keels, and they had dropped depth charges into water they could not see through, hoping the explosions would find their mark. They had every reason to hate the men aboard U-889. The Battle of the Atlantic had been one of the longest, most grinding campaigns of the entire war, and the Royal Canadian Navy had borne a disproportionate share of it. Canadian corvettes had escorted more convoys, covered more ocean, and endured more hardship than almost any other Allied naval force. The losses had been real. The grief had been real. And yet, as the 4 Canadian warships closed the distance to U-889, there was no aggression, no warning shots, no loudspeaker threats. The ships took up positions around the submarine, one on each quarter, maintaining a professional distance, signaling by lamp and flag. The instructions were clear: follow, comply, proceed as directed. HMCS Rockcliffe and HMCS Dunvegan were instructed to escort U-889 into Shelburne, Nova Scotia. However, 24 hours after the interception, the 2 ships passed their charge to the frigates HMCS Buckingham and HMCS Inch Aaron of Escort Group 28, some 140 miles south-southeast of Sable Island. The handoff was routine, professional, the kind of coordinated naval movement that the Canadian escort force had perfected over 6 years of convoy operations. For the German crew, watching through periscopes and from the bridge, the efficiency was unsettling. These were not disorganized captors. These were men who knew exactly what they were doing. And what they were doing was not violent. It was orderly. It was calm. It was, in every measurable way, the opposite of what the crew of U-889 had been told to expect. The frigates took station. The submarine fell into line. The small convoy began its slow passage southwest, toward the coast of Nova Scotia. The sea was rough. The weather was cold. The escort ships rolled in the swells, their crews going about their duties with the weary competence of men who had done this 1,000 times. The only difference was that this time, the vessel between them was not a merchant ship they were protecting. It was a submarine they were accepting, and inside that submarine, the crew watched. They waited, and they began, slowly, to realize that the violence they had been promised was not coming. The passage from the open Atlantic to the coast of Nova Scotia took days. Although spotted by a Canadian aircraft and intercepted by Canadian ships on the 10th of May, poor weather delayed U-889's official surrender until the 13th, when the submarine arrived at Shelburne, Nova Scotia. The intervening days were filled with monotony, tension, and the slow accumulation of a silence that no one on the submarine knew how to interpret. The escort ships maintained formation. The frigates HMCS Buckingham and HMCS Inch Aaron flanked the submarine on either side, close enough to observe, far enough to react. The Canadian crews rotated watches, cooked meals, checked equipment, and kept their weapons accessible but not pointed. The submarine was not treated as a prize, it was treated as a procedure. For the German crew, the experience was disorienting. They were accustomed to the rhythms of combat patrol, the long hours of submerged silence, the sudden terror of a depth charge attack, the adrenaline of a torpedo run. Now they were on the surface, in daylight, surrounded by enemy warships, and nothing was happening. No demands were being made, no threats were being issued. The Canadian ships simply sailed alongside them, steady and patient, as if escorting a damaged vessel home. The coastline of Nova Scotia began to take shape on the horizon, low hills covered in spruce, rocky shorelines, the cold green water of the Scotian shelf. For the German sailors, most of whom had never seen North America, the landscape was alien. It was not the shattered cities of Germany. It was not the bombed harbors of France. It was intact, quiet, undamaged. The trees stood straight. The shoreline was unbroken. There were no pillboxes, no barbed wire, no gun emplacements visible from the sea. This was a country that had not been invaded, a country that had fought the war from a distance, across an ocean, and remained whole. That contrast was not lost on the crew. They had left a Germany that was disintegrating. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, refugees clogging every road. The country they had sworn to defend was being dismantled, and they had sailed away from it into the Atlantic on a mission that no longer had meaning. Now they were approaching a country that was still standing, still functioning, still operating with the kind of quiet efficiency that Germany had lost years ago. The submarine passed Sable Island, the low sandbar that had claimed hundreds of ships over the centuries. It passed the outer approaches to Halifax, where the Royal Canadian Navy had based its Atlantic operations for the duration of the war. It turned southwest, following the coast toward Shelburne, a small harbor town on the southern shore of Nova Scotia that had served as a naval repair base throughout the conflict. During the Second World War, a naval repair base had been established at Shelburne, where many Allied ships were refitted and repaired. It was one of the most important of the Royal Canadian Navy's East Coast bases during the war years. The anti-submarine boom at the entrance to Shelburne Harbor came into view. A steel net stretched across the water, designed to prevent exactly the kind of vessel now approaching from entering undetected. The irony was precise. The boom that had been built to keep U-boats out was now being opened to let one in. The submarine slowed. The escort ships tightened formation. Signal flags were raised. Somewhere on the bridge of U-889, Breuker stood and watched the harbor open before him. He was 26 years old, commanding a submarine that had never fired a weapon in combat, entering an enemy port that he had been ordered to attack. The distance between what he had been told and what he was seeing could not be measured in nautical miles. It could only be measured in belief. The official surrender of U-889 took place on the 13th of May, 1945, off the Shelburne Whistle Buoy, 7 miles from the anti-submarine boom gate. The weather was gray. The sea was calm enough. The submarine sat low in the water, its hull dark against the lighter surface, its conning tower exposed, its deck empty. The surrender included the hoisting of the British ensign 12 miles off Shelburne. The Canadian naval authorities had prepared for this moment with precision. There were procedures for accepting the surrender of a submarine, and they followed them exactly. Captain Miles of the Royal Canadian Navy was present to take over the official surrender. He boarded first and, with the aid of an interpreter, asked whether Breuker was ready to surrender. The answer was affirmative. There was no drama, no confrontation, no raised voices. The boarding party went below, announcing the submarine safe after a 54-minute investigation. 54 minutes. Nearly an hour of careful, methodical inspection, checking for demolition charges, booby traps, scuttling preparations. The boarding party included one officer expert in mines, demolition, and booby traps, and 4 men from the Canadian Military Police. Men were stationed at the torpedo tubes and tube firing gear in case of hostile intentions by a member of the crew. The Canadians were cautious. They were not naive. They understood that a submarine full of armed torpedoes and desperate men was a dangerous environment. But they were not cruel. They were professional. The captain was willing to steam U-889 into harbor, so the Canadians left him with half his crew. The men who were leaving were separated into different groups: officers, petty officers, and ratings. The separation was standard military protocol, designed to prevent organized resistance and to facilitate processing. It was not punishment. It was procedure. Only 2 members of the crew turned to their captain with the raised arm salute. They were quietly told not to be so foolish and were moved aboard the motor launch. This small detail carries enormous weight. 2 men, out of a crew of 48, reflexively performed the gesture they had been trained to perform for years, and they were not beaten for it. They were not restrained. They were corrected, calmly, and moved along. The reflex of ideology met the reality of custody, and custody won without raising its voice. There was no trouble. The crew carried on their work quietly and efficiently, as though nothing unusual was taking place. As though nothing unusual was taking place. That sentence, recorded by a Canadian officer in his report, contains the entire paradox of the moment. For the German crew, everything was unusual. They were surrendering their boat to the enemy. They were submitting to foreign authority. They were entering a future they could not predict, and yet they did it quietly, efficiently, as if the training that had prepared them for war had also, inadvertently, prepared them for this. The white ensign was raised over U-889. The German naval ensign came down. The transfer of authority was complete. The boat that had left Germany weeks earlier as a weapon of the Kriegsmarine was now property of the Royal Canadian Navy. And the men who had sailed it across the Atlantic as warriors were now prisoners. They stood on the deck of the motor launch, surrounded by Canadian sailors, and looked back at the submarine they had called home. It sat in the harbor, motionless, already being examined by foreign hands. And the gap between what they had expected and what they had experienced began to widen into something that would take years to fully understand. The crew of U-889 was taken off the submarine and processed according to established protocols. On arrival in Shelburne Harbor, the crew was taken off the sub and transferred to Halifax, where they were interned in the naval dockyard. But before that transfer, they went through the initial stages of prisoner of war processing at Shelburne itself, and what happened during those hours mattered more than any of them could have anticipated. The men were counted, names were recorded, ranks were documented, personal effects were collected, catalogued, and stored. Weapons were confiscated, including sidearms from the officers and any knives or tools that could be considered hazardous. The process was thorough. It was also impersonal, not in the sense of being cold, but in the sense of being systematic. The Canadians did not treat the prisoners as individuals to be judged. They treated them as personnel to be administered. Medical checks followed. Each man was examined for injuries, illness, and general condition. After weeks at sea in a submarine, the crew was pale, thin, and exhausted. The air inside a Type 9 U-boat on a long patrol was toxic with diesel fumes, battery acid vapor, and the accumulated smell of men living in a sealed tube. Skin infections were common. Respiratory issues were endemic. Dental problems went untreated. The Canadian medical staff noted what they found and provided what treatment was available. There were no speeches, no lectures, no expressions of contempt. The doctors did their work and moved on. The food came next. Simple rations, bread, hot soup, coffee. For men who had been eating from dwindling submarine stores for weeks, the food was not remarkable in its quality. It was remarkable in its presence. No one withheld it. No one made them beg for it. No one used it as leverage. It was distributed evenly, without ceremony, the way food is given to men who are hungry. And this was the moment that began to fracture the worldview that had held these men together for years. Not a dramatic revelation, not a confrontation with truth. Just bread and soup, given without malice, in a building on the Nova Scotia coast, by men wearing the uniform of the enemy. The machinery of ideology requires constant reinforcement. It needs threat. It needs fear. It needs the enemy to behave exactly as described in the briefings and the newsreels. When the enemy fails to cooperate with the narrative, when the enemy simply hands you a bowl of soup and moves on to the next man in line, the machinery has nothing to grip. It spins in place, and eventually, it slows. The prisoners were organized into groups. Officers were separated from enlisted men, as required by international law. Guard details were assigned. Bunking arrangements were made. The Canadians who performed these duties were not elite soldiers. They were naval personnel, many of them reservists, men who had volunteered for service and were now carrying out the unglamorous final tasks of a war that was winding down. They did not celebrate. They did not gloat. They processed the prisoners the way they processed paperwork, competently, quietly, and without excess. For the crew of U-889, this was not what defeat was supposed to look like. Defeat was supposed to be violent, degrading, punitive. That was the promise of the propaganda. That was the justification for fighting to the last. And here they were, alive, fed, sheltered, and unharmed, standing in a Canadian naval facility that smelled of wood and salt water, watching their captors go about their duties with the tired efficiency of men who wanted nothing more than for the war to be over. The system did not care about their ideology. The system only cared about their names, their ranks, and their physical condition. And in that indifference, something far more powerful than punishment was being delivered. The system was showing them that they were not special. They were not monsters. They were not the fearsome warriors of the propaganda films. They were 48 men who had lost a war, and they were being handled accordingly. No more, no less. The first full day of captivity passed without incident, and the second, and the third. Each day carried the same quiet rhythm. Wake, eat, stand for count, wait. The meals were regular, the portions were adequate. The food was plain but sufficient, the kind of military rations that sustained without inspiring: bread, tinned meat, vegetables, tea. The Canadian Guards delivered it on schedule and collected the plates without conversation. For the crew of U-889, the shock was not in any single moment. It was in the accumulation. The beds had mattresses. The blankets were clean. The latrines functioned. The buildings were heated. The guards carried weapons but did not brandish them. The routine was strict but not cruel. Every element of their captivity, from the spacing of meals to the timing of roll calls, followed a pattern that felt less like imprisonment and less like punishment and more like administration. This was deeply disorienting. Inside the U-boat, life had been governed by necessity and danger. Every action had consequences. Every sound mattered. Sleep was stolen in fragments between watches. Food was eaten standing up, often cold, often stale. Privacy did not exist. The men had lived pressed against each other in a metal cylinder for weeks, sharing air, sharing fear, sharing the constant low hum of machinery that kept them alive. The transition from that environment to a shore-based facility with walls, floors, and space between bunks was jarring in ways that transcended comfort. The silence was the hardest part. On the submarine, there was always noise. The diesel engines, the electric motors, the hiss of the ventilation system, the creak of the hull under pressure, the ping of sonar, the muffled thud of distant explosions. These sounds formed the auditory landscape of their war. Now there was wind, birds, the distant sound of harbor traffic, Canadian voices speaking a language most of the crew did not understand. The silence between those sounds was vast, and inside it, thought expanded in directions that the busy routine of submarine patrol had never allowed. Some of the men slept for hours. Their bodies, deprived of real rest for weeks, collapsed into unconsciousness with a totality that startled even them. Others could not sleep at all. They lay on their bunks and stared at the ceiling, their minds cycling through the same questions. What would happen next? Whether their families were alive? Whether Germany still existed as a country? Whether the world they had left behind 6 weeks ago bore any resemblance to the world they would eventually return to? All prisoners of war were legally protected under the terms of the Geneva Convention and were adequately provisioned and housed as required by the Convention. The Canadians adhered to this framework with a consistency that the German prisoners found difficult to reconcile with their training. Canadians living near the camps believed the prisoners received better food than they themselves enjoyed under wartime rationing. This was not generosity. It was compliance. The Canadian government had committed to the provisions of international law, and it fulfilled that commitment with the same methodical determination it had applied to the rest of the war effort. The crew of U-889 did not know this yet. They did not understand the legal framework that governed their captivity. They only knew that they were being fed, sheltered, and left alone. And each day that passed without violence, without humiliation, without the degradation they had been promised, the foundation of their belief system cracked a little further. No one told them their beliefs were wrong. No one argued with them. No one presented evidence or made a case. The routine simply continued, meal after meal, count after count, day after day, and the truth arrived not as a revelation, but as an absence. The absence of cruelty, the absence of punishment, the absence of everything they had been trained to expect. That absence was louder than any speech. On May 14th, U-889 was taken by the Royal Canadian Navy to Halifax. The crew followed separately, under guard, transported by road from Shelburne to the naval dockyard at Halifax. The distance was roughly 200 kilometers, a journey of several hours through the interior of Nova Scotia and along the coast. For the German sailors, most of whom had not stood on solid ground for over a month, the drive was an immersion in a world they had never seen and could barely comprehend. Nova Scotia in mid-May was green. The forests were thick with spruce and birch. The roads passed through small towns with wooden houses, church steeples, general stores, and harbors full of fishing boats. There were no checkpoints, no bombed-out buildings, no columns of refugees, no soldiers on the roads. The war had not touched this place, at least not in the way it had touched Europe. The people who lived here had sent their sons across the ocean. They had rationed their food. They had worried and waited and grieved. But the landscape itself was whole. For men who had come from a country where cities were burning and civilians were dying in the streets, the normalcy of Nova Scotia was almost unbearable. It was a mirror held up to what Germany had lost. Not just the war, but the physical reality of an intact civilization. The houses were painted. The gardens were tended. Children played in yards. The world outside the vehicle windows was not at war. It was at peace. And that peace was not fragile or temporary. It was structural. It was built into the roads, the buildings, the quiet confidence of a country that had never been invaded. Halifax appeared through the windshield like a city from another era. The harbor was enormous, one of the largest natural harbors in the world, and it was full of ships. Warships, merchant vessels, patrol boats, tugs, the infrastructure of a naval power at the peak of its wartime capacity. Cranes lined the dockyard. Warehouses stretched along the waterfront. The city climbed the hill behind the harbor, a dense grid of buildings and streets alive with traffic and purpose. The German prisoners were taken into the naval dockyard and processed again. More forms, more counts, more medical checks. The facility was larger than Shelburne, more organized, more permanent. It was clear that this was not an improvised arrangement. Canada had been holding prisoners of war for years. Canada operated prison camps for combatant German prisoners of war during the Second World War, holding 34,000 by war's end. The system was mature. The protocols were established. The guards knew their roles. The crew of U-889 was absorbed into this system without ceremony. They were given numbers. They were assigned quarters. They were told the rules. And then they were left to begin the long, strange process of existing inside a country they had been sent to attack. Halifax was not a battlefield. It was a city. It had restaurants and shops and parks and libraries. It had streetcars and cinemas and churches. It had women walking to work and men reading newspapers on benches. The war had made it busy, swollen with military personnel and industrial activity, but it had not made it ugly. It had not made it desperate. It had not made it anything like what the crew had been told enemy territory would look like. And that, perhaps more than anything, was the detail that lodged itself deepest. The enemy was not living in fear. The enemy was living, fully, practically, normally. And the crew of U-889, sitting in a dockyard compound behind wire, could see it from their windows, a functioning world, an unbroken world. A world that had won the war and had the quiet confidence to prove it. The lie did not crack all at once. It cracked the way ice cracks on a warming lake, in thin lines that spread slowly, silently, until the surface that once seemed solid reveals itself to be a web of fractures held together by nothing but proximity and habit. For the crew of U-889, the process was internal. There were no group discussions, no confessionals, no dramatic confrontations between believers and skeptics. The men simply lived inside the gap between what they had been told and what they were experiencing. And each day the gap grew wider, and each day the effort required to maintain the old narrative grew more exhausting. The propaganda had said the Allies would beat them. No one had been beaten. The propaganda had said the Allies would starve them. The meals arrived on time. The propaganda had said the Allies would humiliate them, parade them through streets, strip them of dignity. Instead, they had been processed, housed, and left largely to themselves. The propaganda had said the enemy was barbaric. The enemy was bureaucratic. And bureaucracy, it turned out, was far more effective at dismantling belief than barbarity could ever be. Some of the men resisted the realization. Resistance was natural. The human mind does not easily abandon the framework that has sustained it, especially under duress. Some argued internally that the good treatment was temporary, a tactic designed to extract information before the real punishment began. Some believed the Canadians were simply following orders from higher authority and that the true face of the enemy would emerge once the initial processing was complete. Some clung to the idea that Germany would somehow recover, that the surrender was a ruse, that the war would resume and they would be rescued. But as the days passed and the treatment remained consistent, these arguments lost their strength. Reality has a patience that ideology cannot match. Reality does not argue. It simply persists. And with each meal served, each medical check completed, each night passed without incident, reality accumulated like sediment, burying the old beliefs under the weight of ordinary experience. The propaganda stories that the crew had been filled with had accounted for their very high morale and state of confidence. Breuker himself had been convinced that if the army had held out for another 2 months, the U-boats would have sunk all shipping crossing the Atlantic and the English Channel. This was the scale of the delusion. Not small, not marginal, total. The captain of U-889, a trained officer with combat experience in torpedo boats, had genuinely believed that the U-boat arm was on the verge of winning the war. He had believed this because he had been told this. He had been told this because the system required him to believe it, and the system had worked, right up until the moment it was exposed to something it could not control. The reality of the enemy's behavior. The lie was not defeated by counter-argument. It was not defeated by evidence presented in a briefing room. It was defeated by soup, by clean blankets, by guards who did not shout, by a system that treated prisoners as prisoners and not as enemies to be destroyed. The lie was defeated by the mundane, relentless normality of Canadian military custody, and that defeat was more thorough, more lasting, and more psychologically devastating than any battlefield loss could ever be. Because a man can lose a battle and maintain his beliefs. He can lose a campaign and maintain his beliefs. He can even lose a war and maintain his beliefs if the enemy cooperates with the narrative by behaving the way the propaganda said they would. But when the enemy refuses to cooperate, when the enemy simply treats you like a human being and expects nothing in return, the beliefs have nowhere to go. They collapse inward. And what remains is not anger or defiance. It is confusion. And then, slowly, quietly, something worse than confusion, the recognition that you were wrong, not about a tactic, not about a strategy, about everything. Nothing in the training manuals of the Kriegsmarine had prepared the crew of U-889 for what they found in Canada. The gap between expectation and reality was not a discrepancy. It was an abyss. They had been trained to expect interrogation by specialists who would use physical and psychological pressure to extract operational intelligence. What they received were interviews conducted through interpreters, in rooms with chairs and tables, where questions were asked and answers were recorded. The interviews were thorough. The Canadians wanted to know about equipment, capabilities, signal frequencies, and operational orders. But the method was professional inquiry, not coercion. During questioning, when sensitive topics arose, the interrogators were careful not to press too hard, choosing not to pursue subjects that might cause the prisoners to become uncooperative. They had been trained to expect solitary confinement, deprivation, and disorientation. What they received were shared quarters, regular schedules, and a degree of autonomy within the compound that would have been unthinkable under the regime they had served. What was significant about Canadian prisoner of war camps for German soldiers was their commitment to strictly adhere to the Geneva Convention. This commitment was not performative. It was institutional. It was embedded in the regulations, the supply chains, the training of the guards, and the oversight of international observers. They had been trained to expect hostility from the civilian population, mobs, insults, stones thrown at transport vehicles. What they encountered was indifference. The Canadians who saw them being moved from one facility to another did not cheer or jeer. They watched, some with curiosity, some with sadness, some with the blank expression of people who had been at war for 6 years and simply wanted it to be over. The hatred that the propaganda had promised was absent, not suppressed, absent. They had been trained to expect that capture would mean the end of their identity as soldiers. Instead, they were classified, ranked, and organized according to their military status. Officers were separated from enlisted men, as the convention required. Canadian camps housed prisoners from all 3 branches of the German armed forces. However, officers and other ranks were always kept in separate camps, in full accordance with the Geneva Convention. The structure of military hierarchy, even in captivity, was preserved. The Canadians did not strip them of their rank. They documented it. None of this had been mentioned in training. The briefings had covered evasion techniques, resistance to interrogation, methods of scuttling, and the penalties for cooperation with the enemy. They had not covered the possibility that the enemy might follow the rules. They had not covered the possibility that captivity might be survivable, bearable, and conducted with a professionalism that matched or exceeded what the prisoners had experienced in their own service. The training had prepared them for a world that did not exist, and now they lived in the world that did. For many of the men, this was the hardest part. Harder than the submarine patrols, harder than the fear of depth charges, harder than the uncertainty of the final days at sea. Because those experiences, however terrible, had been comprehensible within the framework they had been given. The framework had answers for everything that happened inside the war. It had no answers for what happened after. The gap between training and reality was not a gap that could be filled with new information. It was a gap that required the demolition of old information. The slow and painful process of realizing that the people who had trained you had lied. Not about tactics, not about navigation, about the nature of the world, about the character of the enemy, about the meaning of the war itself. The days in Canadian custody settled into a rhythm that was as relentless as it was unremarkable. Wake, eat, count, wait, eat again, walk the perimeter if allowed, read if books were available, talk if there was anything left to say, sleep, repeat. Extended periods of internment took both a physical and a mental toll, so prisoners took up a wide range of activities to help cope. Prisoners assembled sports teams and orchestras, put on theatrical performances, built elaborate handicrafts, and took educational classes to help pass the time. These activities were not unique to the crew of U-889. They were features of the broader Canadian prisoner of war system, a system that had been operating for years and had developed its own institutional rhythms. The crew adapted, slowly, reluctantly. The younger men adjusted faster, their minds more flexible, their attachment to ideology less calcified. The older petty officers and the officers themselves took longer, their identities, more tightly bound to the service they had given and the beliefs that had sustained them through it. But adaptation happened for all of them, not because they chose it, but because the alternative was psychological paralysis, and the human instinct toward survival includes survival of the mind. They learned the schedules. They learned the rules. They learned which guards were strict and which were lenient, which meal times were reliable and which might shift, which areas of the compound offered a view of the harbor and which faced only walls. They developed the small routines of captivity that prisoners everywhere develop: the morning walk, the afternoon rest, the evening conversation that circled the same topics without resolution. Some of the men received mail eventually. Letters from Germany, routed through the International Red Cross, arrived weeks or months after being sent. The news was rarely good. Homes destroyed, families displaced, cities they remembered as functioning, communities now described in terms of rubble and occupation zones. The letters confirmed what the crew had suspected but had not yet been able to verify. Germany was not recovering. Germany was being dismantled. The country they had fought for was being divided among the very powers they had been sent to defeat. German prisoners of war in Canada and England fared best of all, so much so that some emigrated after the war. This fact, which would have been incomprehensible to the crew of U-889 at the time of their capture, became less incomprehensible with each passing week. The conditions in Canada were not luxurious. They were adequate. And adequacy, after years of total war, submarine patrols, air raids, rationing, and the constant expectation of death, felt almost like abundance. The guards changed shifts. The seasons began to turn. The spring of 1945 gave way to summer, and the compound that had felt like a cage began to feel like a holding pattern, a space between the war they had fought and the future they could not yet imagine. The men existed in a temporal limbo, no longer combatants, not yet civilians, suspended between a past that had ended and a future that had not begun. Time moved differently in captivity. Without missions, without objectives, without the adrenaline of operational duty, the days stretched and blurred. The men grew restless, then resigned, then something beyond resignation. A state of quiet endurance that had no name, but was recognizable in their posture, their eyes, the way they held their tin cups during meals. They were learning, without anyone teaching them, what it meant to lose not just a war, but a worldview. And the classroom was not a room. It was a routine, a Canadian routine, built on regulations and decency that dismantled their certainties one ordinary day at a time. The war ended in Europe on the 8th of May, 1945. For U-889, the surrender came 5 days later, on the 13th. For the crew in Canadian custody, the end of the war was not a single event. It was a gradual fading, a slow diminishment of urgency that left behind only the bureaucratic apparatus of captivity. There was no ceremony for the crew of U-889, no moment where someone stood before them and declared that their war was over. The war simply stopped mattering. The radio reports that filtered into the compound spoke of occupation zones, war crimes tribunals, the founding of new political structures in a divided Germany. The language was foreign, not just in the literal sense, but in the conceptual sense. The world being described was not the world they had fought for. It was a world built on the assumption that the world they had fought for was wrong. U-889 had surrendered before it could carry out orders to attack, shipping off the port of New York. Its crew were fortunate. An estimated 75% of U-boat crew members did not survive the war. This statistic, when it reached the prisoners, carried a weight that no propaganda could counterbalance. 3 out of 4 of their comrades were dead. The U-boat arm, which they had been told was the most elite and effective branch of the Kriegsmarine, had suffered the highest casualty rate of any service in the German military. Of 859 U-boats that set off on war patrols, 648 were lost, 75%. The boats themselves had been destroyed at a rate that made combat patrol a near-certain death sentence. The crew of U-889 had survived because they had surrendered, not because they had fought, not because they had been brave, not because the ideology they believed in had protected them. They had survived because a 26-year-old captain had chosen to raise a flag instead of opening the sea valves. That choice, which the doctrine of Regenbogen had tried to make impossible, was the reason they were alive. And the realization of that fact sat differently in each man's chest, depending on how tightly he still held the beliefs that had nearly killed him. The summer of 1945 passed. The autumn came. The compound quieted further as the administrative machinery of the war wound down. Guards were demobilized. Facilities were consolidated. The urgency that had defined 6 years of conflict dissolved into paperwork, repatriation schedules, and the slow, impersonal process of returning tens of thousands of prisoners to countries that no longer resembled the places they had left. For the crew, the end was not dramatic. It was bureaucratic. Forms were filled. Dates were assigned. Transport was arranged. The men who had entered Canada as prisoners of war would leave it as released detainees, carrying documents that recorded their names, their service, and their status. They would return to a Germany divided into 4 occupation zones, a country whose cities were rubble, whose economy was shattered, and whose political identity was being rewritten by the same powers that had treated them with such confusing decency. There was no parade, no revenge, no final reckoning. Just a departure, quiet and administrative, from a country that had held them without malice and released them without fanfare. The anticlimax was the point. The first real defeat of the crew of U-889 did not happen at sea. It did not happen when the Liberator circled overhead on the 10th of May. It did not happen when the Canadian warships appeared on the horizon. It did not happen when Breuker gave the order to surrender, or when the British ensign was raised over the conning tower, or when the crew was taken off the boat and placed in Canadian custody. The first real defeat happened later, quietly, internally. In the space between one thought and the next, in the moment a man realizes that the story he has been living inside is not true, not partially true, not exaggerated, not distorted by wartime necessity, simply not true. The propaganda had told them the enemy was savage. The enemy was methodical. The propaganda had told them the enemy would degrade them. The enemy processed them. The propaganda had told them that surrender was death by another name. Surrender was bread, a medical check, and a bunk with a clean blanket. The propaganda had told them that the Western Allies were hypocrites who spoke of human rights while practicing brutality. The Western Allies followed the Geneva Convention with a consistency that embarrassed the propaganda by making it irrelevant. This was the defeat that mattered, not the military defeat, which was a matter of strategy, resources, and industrial capacity, things that could be understood and accepted within the framework of war. But the ideological defeat, the recognition that the framework itself was false, that the leaders who had sent them to sea had lied, not about the odds, but about the nature of the world, about the character of the people they were fighting, about the meaning of the war itself. Breuker survived the war and lived until November 2010, reaching the age of 91. He outlived the war by 65 years. Unlike many other U-boats, which during their service lost men due to accidents and various other causes. U-889 did not suffer any casualties. The crew survived intact. Every man who boarded the submarine in Germany returned home alive. In a service where 3 out of 4 men died, this was not a minor outcome. It was a statistical miracle, achieved not through combat excellence but through the simple, unglamorous act of surrender. The boat itself did not survive. It was moved to Halifax on the 15th of May and commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy, which used it for trials. U-889 was one of 10 U-boats allocated to the United States as part of the Tripartite Naval Commission in Berlin in November 1945. She sailed to Portsmouth, New Hampshire on the 10th of January 1946. She was sunk off Cape Cod on the 20th of November 1947. The submarine that had crossed the Atlantic to attack Canadian shipping was examined, tested, transferred, and ultimately sent to the bottom by the very Navy that had accepted its surrender. The steel that had carried 48 men through the war rests now in 850 feet of water off the coast of Massachusetts, undiscovered, unremarkable, forgotten. But the men remembered. Not all of them talked about it. Not all of them processed the experience in the same way. Some returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives without looking back. Some carried the memory of Canadian custody like a stone in their pocket, a weight that never quite went away, a reference point against which every subsequent experience was measured. The defeat was not in the surrender. The defeat was in the discovery that the world was not what they had been told, that the enemy was not what they had been taught, that the war they had fought with discipline and courage had been built on a foundation of lies so comprehensive that even the most basic assumptions, the ones about what would happen if they were captured, turned out to be wrong. That discovery could not be reversed. Once a man sees that the narrative he lived inside was constructed to serve the interests of those who sent him to die, he cannot unsee it. The knowledge persists. It becomes part of the architecture of his understanding. And it changes not just how he remembers the war, but how he understands everything that came before it and everything that came after. This was the first real defeat. Not a defeat of arms, a defeat of belief. And it was delivered not by bombs or torpedoes, but by the quiet, persistent refusal of reality to match the story. The story of U-889 is not a story of heroism. It is not a story of villainy. It is a story of what happens when a carefully constructed lie encounters an unremarkable truth, and the truth does not announce itself, does not argue, does not insist. It simply exists. And the lie which depended on the absence of truth to survive collapses under the weight of what is actually there. The crew of U-889 expected violence. They received procedure. They expected hatred. They received indifference. They expected the worst of the enemy. They received the ordinary. And the ordinary was enough. It was enough to undo years of training, months of operational conditioning, and a lifetime of ideological architecture that had been built to make men fight, obey, and die without question. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a final silence. The silence of a submarine sitting in a Canadian harbor with a foreign flag flying from its mast. The silence of a crew standing on the deck of a motor launch, watching their boat being taken from them. The silence of a compound in Halifax where the meals came on time and the guards did not shout and the days passed without event. The silence of men realizing one by one in the privacy of their own minds that they had been wrong. That silence is the real ending of this story. Not the tactical details, not the dates and coordinates, not the names of ships or the tonnage of submarines. the silence. The moment when a man trained for war encounters a world that is not at war with him and does not know what to do with the discovery. U-889 was one of the last German submarines to surrender in the Second World War. Its crew carried no victories. Its captain sank no ships. Its torpedoes were never fired. And yet, in the quiet mathematics of survival, the boat achieved something that most of its peers did not. It brought its men home alive. All of them. Every one. The enemy they had been warned about was not what they had been told. The war's lies did not survive contact with reality, and the men who discovered this did not discover it through argument or persuasion. They discovered it through soup, through blankets, through the sound of Canadian voices giving routine orders in a language they did not speak, through the slow, undeniable accumulation of evidence that the world was not the way they had been taught. That is the story. Not of mercy, not of victory, not of forgiveness, but of what happens when the truth is simply allowed to be present, without commentary, without performance, without intent. The truth does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be delivered in a speech or written in a treaty. It only needs to be lived. And for 48 men on a submarine off the coast of Canada, in May of 1945, it was.